Welcome to episode 95 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent writing crime fiction inspired by true crime FBI cases. Today we get to speak to retired agent Eugene Casey, who served with the FBI for 21 years. As a special agent, he used skills acquired from prior employment as a Wall Street investment firm compliance officer to work white-collar crime matters, drug money laundering, food stamp benefit fraud, and terrorist financing investigations. In this episode, Eugene Casey reviews a series of interviews he conducted with IIich Ramirez Sanchez, known worldwide as Carlos the Jackal, the inventor of modern-day terrorism. Before Osama Bin Laden, Carlos the Jackal was the world's most famous terrorist. At the time of these debriefings, Eugene Casey was serving as Assistant Legal Attaché for the FBI in Paris, France. During his career, Casey received several awards from the Department of Justice, including one for spearheading the Salt Lake Olympic bribery investigation. He also served as the supervisor of the Joint Task Force on Terrorist Finance in Saudi Arabia and was the unit chief for the Eurasian Organized Crime Unit of the Criminal Investigative Division. His last bureau assignment before retiring earlier this year was as an instructor at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia, teaching interview and interrogation skills. I think this is going to be another one of those entertaining but highly educational and informative interviews. Not only do you get to learn all about Carlos the Jackal, but Eugene Casey also provides insights into good interviewing skills. I really think you're going to enjoy this one. But before we get to the interview, I just have a couple of things to say. This has been just a strange week. The FBI has been pulled back again into the political discussion where it should never be. I actually lost sleep last night trying to decide what I would say because I'm sure many of you have questions about what you're hearing. Several days ago, the FBI Agents Association issued a statement, and today the director of the FBI spoke publicly. One of the things that I really want to accomplish with this podcast is allowing the public to see who the FBI is. I go out of my way not to talk about politics, and so guess what? I'm not going to do that today. I have decided to let the 95 interviews that I've done with retired special agents showing their bravery, their integrity, their independence, and their loyalty to their country. I'm going to let those interviews speak for me. The only thing that I will say is when you hear things that are in contrast to what you've learned from the podcast, just remember this line. That's not how this works. That's not how any of this works. I just want to remind you that my 100th episode is only 5 episodes away, and I have gathered together 10 more cliches and misconceptions about the FBI. We initially covered 10 in the 50th episode. Thank you so much if you have sent me some of the things that you'd like for us to address in this second look at what books, TV, and films get wrong about the FBI. When you're reading a book or watching a show about the FBI, what irks you? That's what I wrote about in my December email to my reader team. So if you haven't checked that out yet, please do. If you're not a member of my reader team, then all you need to do to join is go to my website, jerrywilliams.com, and sign up when you see the pop-up, or go to my Facebook author page, Jerry Williams Author, and you'll see the sign up button there. The monthly email is like a digest of the episodes produced the month before, my crime fiction recommendations, and I also keep you up to date on the FBI in books, TV, and movies. So I hope you sign up to be a member of my reader team. I also want to say congratulations to reader team members Teresa Greenhill, Ashley Walter, and Edward Smith, the winners of my November giveaway. They each received a limited edition FBI ornament and a signed copy of my FBI crime thriller, Pay to Play. Now here's the show. I'm excited to introduce my guest, Eugene Casey. Hi, Eugene. How are you?
I'm great. How you doing, Jerry?
I'm doing fantastic. I am so excited to speak with you today because everyone knows and has heard about Carlos the Jackal, a known terrorist. And I'm just amazed that you actually met with him 4 times and interviewed him for hours, 3 times, and really got to know him. He shared so much of what he had done and why he did it. I'm not only amazed about the opportunity to learn about Carlos the Jackal, but I'm also excited to talk to you about interview skills and interview strategies. I understand you taught that at one time at the FBI Academy?
I did. I ended my career, my last 2 years with the Bureau at the FBI Academy as an instructor, focusing on interviewing and interrogation techniques.
Was that the position you were in when you were assigned to interview Carlos the Jackal?
No. In my 21 years with the Bureau, I had many different assignments, different cities domestically and internationally. And when I got involved in this case, I was actually assigned to our legal attaché office in Paris, France. So I was the Assistant Legal Attaché, or the ALAT, in Paris for 4 years, from 2011 to 2015. And my involvement in this case began in 2012.
And the purpose of the interview?
I was in Paris one day with my colleague Bob, and we were driving through Paris, and we were passing by La Santé prison, which is the most infamous prison in France. And Bob said to me, "Hey, you know who's in there?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Carlos the Jackal is in there." And I said, "Really?" And he said, "Yeah, he said we were supposed to actually interview him one time, but it never happened." And that piqued my curiosity. And so when I got back to our office in the American Embassy in Paris, I started doing some research, and I found out indeed there had been an attempt to submit what we call an MLAT request to have him interviewed on a cold case that the FBI had worked way back in 1973. I kind of rejuvenated this request, resubmitted it, and in the process of that, studied Carlos's background and also as much as I could about this case. And the case involved the assassination or murder of an Israeli diplomat in Maryland in 1973. And his name was Joseph Alon. And he was a colonel in the Israeli Air Force, actually a war hero in Israel. And he became a military attaché in the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. And he was in the process of completing his tour in Washington, and he was actually about to retire from the military. And he was coming home from an Israeli embassy function one night at the end of June in 1973 with his wife, and he pulled up into his driveway in Chevy Chase, Maryland. As he got out of his car around midnight, someone stepped out from behind the bushes and shot him 5 times. And unfortunately, one of those shots pierced his heart and was fatal, and he ended up dying on his front lawn in the arms of his wife and his daughters. And it was dark, and the assailant got away, and there was very little physical evidence left at the scene. Because it was a murder of a foreign diplomat, the FBI was involved, as was the Montgomery County, Maryland Police Department. And it was pretty much a major case back in 1973. Henry Kissinger, who was the National Security Advisor at the time, wanted updates because this had foreign policy ramifications, this case. The Israelis wanted it solved. And so there was a lot of pressure on the Bureau to solve this case, and they went through extraordinary efforts to try to solve it. And I've actually finished reading the 7,000-page case file of that original investigation. And unfortunately, it was closed in 1979, unsolved. So this was a cold case. And what happened to me in Paris is when I researched this attempt to interview Carlos the Jackal, the reason he gets involved in this case, in 2008, he wrote a letter from prison in France to, it was actually addressed to his wife, but it was about an article written by an American journalist named Adam Goldman, who wrote about this unsolved case, either, I can't remember if it was the Washington Post or the New York Times, but Mr. Goldman worked for both newspapers. And so an article was published, and Carlos read it from jail, and he responded, and he wrote a letter to his wife saying she should contact Adam Goldman because he knew who murdered Colonel Alone. So I actually have a copy of that letter still with me here. I'll read it to you, what he wrote to his wife, and it says, it's dated July 2008. Carlos the Jackal, that's not his real name. His real name is IIich Ramirez Sanchez. So it's on the letterhead from IIich Ramirez Sanchez, and it says to his wife, who also happens to be his French attorney, it says, "My dearest, Adam Goldman's articles brought me back to my fighting youth 35 years ago. The Black September Second Formation comrades involved in the process of targeting Colonel Joseph Alone have all been killed, all three. Contact with the volunteers who executed the operation in Washington was lost long ago. I may therefore reveal the names of our dead Arab comrades to honor their memory and for history's sake disclose the unusual manner in which Operation Alone came to be. The Associated Press should pay you up front for your working time at your regular hourly rate of lawyers' fees. An identical amount I demand as a contribution to the expenses of my defense team. I shall then be ready to answer directly on the phone to all relevant questions from Mr. Goldman. Yours in revolution, Carlos." So that's the letter that sparked this attempt to have Carlos the Jackal interviewed in prison in France.
Before he wrote this letter, was there any indication that he would have knowledge about this murder?
No, he was not. I read the whole entire 7,000-page original case file. He's not mentioned in it. He wasn't part of the investigation. Carlos, and I'll explain his background, but Carlos was an operational commander for the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which was aligned with the PLO, which was also aligned with Black September. So Carlos knew a lot of these folks in the fighting with different Palestinian factions, or some would say terrorist groups, for their liberation. So for Carlos to claim that he knew Black September operatives makes total sense. And of course, the FBI looked into possible Black September involvement in this case back in the 70s. But Black September had never done a successful operation in the United States. They had attempted one. We all know about the famous attacks in Munich during the 1972 Olympics by Black September. They did attempt one terrorist attack in New York that failed, and they were tried to car bomb the parade route of Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir when she visited New York in the early 70s, and those car bombs failed to detonate. And actually, two of them were towed away by the NYPD before the parade even started, so that was a failed attack. But they had no successful attacks in the United States. So if Carlos's theory that this was a Black September terrorist assassination of Colonel Alone, it would be the first time a Black September successful operation happened in the United States, if that could be proved.
Now, I can see why it would be an interview that the FBI and international law enforcement would be interested in having conducted.
Exactly. So when I saw this request, it originated with an investigator in the Montgomery County PD who put these two things together, who ended up with this letter from Carlos the Jackal regarding Adam Goldman's articles. He did the right thing and tried to get Carlos the Jackal interviewed. It just so happened that he then retired, and a few key people in France retired, and the request was never submitted.
Was the interview with the reporter ever conducted?
No. Adam Goldman did try to contact Carlos the Jackal, I believe, telephonically in prison, but that never happened. And he, of course, was ever going to pay Carlos the Jackal money for this information, and neither was the FBI. So I knew, and part of putting together my strategy to interview Carlos, I knew he would be interested in getting paid for this information. So I had to come up with sort of a counter-argument to that as part of my strategy. But just a little more background on the victim, Joseph Alon. He did help establish the Israeli Air Force, and he actually grew up in Czechoslovakia, and his family was killed during the Holocaust. His father was murdered during the invasion of Czechoslovakia, and his mother and sister both died at Auschwitz. And he only survived because his father sent him to England just before the invasion. And he was a jet fighter pilot. He flew a French Mirage jet for the Israeli Air Force. And then, unfortunately, he was killed in the United States while serving at the Israeli embassy. So my work was kind of cut out for me. I did, I tried to research as much of the original investigation as possible. Unfortunately, as you know, our records back in the 70s were not computerized, and our archives had to locate the old case file. And by the time they found it and scanned it and sent a link to me in Paris, almost a year had gone by, and at that point I was ready to actually conduct the interview. So I didn't even have time to read all 7,000 pages before I talked to Mr. Ramirez, but I did have time to research him because I wanted to learn, obviously, as much about him in advance of an interview as well. So what I learned about Carlos the Jackal is that in the United States particularly, there are a lot of myths and false information about him because of Hollywood and various writers in the media. And he's more well known in Europe because he conducted a lot of his terrorist activities in Europe. So the true story of Carlos is much better known in France than in the United States. Some people would consider him to be the inventor of modern terrorism and the first celebrity terrorist. And he was involved in hijackings, assassinations, bombings, including car bombs he planted on high-speed trains, hand grenade attacks in shopping malls in Paris, RPG attacks at airports, shootings, hostage-takings. He targeted diplomats, government ministers, innocent civilians, and people that he considered traitors to the Palestinian cause. And
what is his connection to Palestine and the Palestinian cause?
Excellent question. He was born in Caracas in Venezuela, and his father was a prominent Marxist attorney. And he ended up moving to London in 1966, where he learned to speak English, and he was actually getting ready to attend the Sorbonne in France for his university education when the student riots broke out in 1968, and his father decided he'd be better off sending him to Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow. So he ends up going to that university in Moscow, but within 2 years he gets expelled. He was apparently a bit of a party animal, if you believe the media reports at the time, which didn't go over very well in Moscow. And so he ends up in 1970 in Palestine, in Jordan, fighting alongside the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, where he was actually wounded. And that's when he was given the nom de guerre of Salem Salim Muhammad. He rose through the ranks of this organization, and by 1973, he was the deputy operational commander for the PFLP external operations for Europe, and he was based then in London and Paris. The PFLP gave him the codename of Carlos, and his first solo attack happened in London, also in 1973. He was assigned to kill the CEO of a big British department store called Marks & Spencer. And that gentleman was targeted because he was Jewish and a major donor of the British various Zionist foundations. So he shows up at this guy's mansion in the suburbs of London with a pistol and forces his way inside the house and shoots him in the face. And with the second shot, his pistol jammed. Carlos escaped, and the man miraculously survived the attack. And that was Carlos's first terrorist event. Unsuccessful, but that kind of put him on the map. And it was the media, the British media, who gave him the nickname Carlos the Jackal, because when the British police eventually found where he had been staying in London, they found a copy of the book The Day of the Jackal by Frederick Forsyth on his bedside table. And it was the media who gave him that nickname, Carlos the Jackal. So some people confuse him with the story in The Day of the Jackal, which is about an international assassin, but they really have nothing to do with each other.
Did he like the nickname? I mean, did he refer to himself as Carlos the Jackal?
He signs a lot of his correspondence Carlos in quotation marks, and that was his official PFLP code name. He doesn't use, as far as I know, he doesn't refer to himself as Carlos the Jackal. That's more of a media thing. And when I met him, I asked him, how he would like me to refer to him, and it was Mr. Ramirez. So to me, he's Mr. Ramirez.
Okay.
But I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit there. But so just to finish with his story of what my research showed of what he did, he was also an innovator in the terrorist world because of his collaboration with other terrorist groups. Now, I told you he was part of the PFLP, but he also conducted operations with the Japanese Red Army and the German Revolutionary Cells, which was also known as the Baader-Meinhof gang in Germany back in the day. He really became notorious in Europe for a couple things in 1975. And one was this famous attack he did at an OPEC oil ministers meeting in Vienna in 1975, where he and his group of commandos stormed the OPEC meeting, killed about 3 people, and took over 60 hostages. And this brought him, obviously, kind of worldwide fame, and he demanded a plane, and he actually put these oil ministers on a plane and flew them to Algeria. And then he ransomed off the ministers to Iran and Saudi Arabia for reportedly millions of dollars. And some reports say he kept some of that money, and some say he gave a lot of that to the PFLP. But he certainly lived more like a wealthy man after that. And also that year, he got a lot of notoriety in France because his group was being investigated by the DST, which is the French equivalent back then of the FBI. And they had terrorism jurisdiction in France, to this sort of the internal security service like the FBI for France. So the DST actually arrested his supervisor in the organization, Mahmoud Morkabel. They forced Mr. Morkabel to take them to where his deputy Carlos was staying. And so when they arrived at the apartment, Carlos actually shot and killed the 2 DST agents, Mr. Morkabel, and wounded a 3rd DST agent. So he became very famous for that, too, and that kind of started his 20-plus years on the run as an international fugitive. Many people didn't know his true name. They didn't have very many photographs or good photographs of him. He did many, many terrorist attacks during those days. In 1982, he tried to kill Jacques Chirac by planting a bomb on a high-speed train in France. One amazing attempted attack he did in France in those days was he tried to attack a nuclear power plant between Strasbourg and Lyon, France, and attacked it with RPGs. And luckily, the core reactor was surrounded by about 5 feet of concrete, and the RPGs, from my understanding of the attack, got through about 3 feet of that and came pretty close to causing a major Chernobyl-like incident in the middle of France. And
wow.
Luckily for us, that attack was not successful. But he was quite an innovator in terms of terrorism, and he also did some famous car bomb attacks in Paris, just off the Champs-Élysées. He blew up the offices of a Syrian newspaper, and that was called Al-Watan Al-Arabi. that attack, I know some French intelligence officers think that attack on that newspaper may have even inspired the Kouachi brothers in their attack on the Charlie Hebdo newspaper in Paris in 2015. So he's had quite an influence in the world of terrorism.
What is his ideology? I mean, terrorists are supposed to be fighting for a cause.
Yeah.
What's his cause?
His cause was the liberation of Palestine. And the PFLP in those days was actually a secular socialist organization. So he was not a religious zealot at all, but he considered himself more of a worldwide revolutionary fighting against the West and capitalism, sort of along the lines of a Fidel Castro or a Che Guevara. Those were kind of his ideological heroes. And he aligned himself with the Palestinian cause and considered himself to be kind of a soldier and a highly skilled assassin in this, what he considered the global war against the capitalist West back then. So the 70s was quite a complicated time, a lot going on, and he was right in the middle of it. And because he spoke so many different languages, he spoke, his native Spanish, English, French, Arabic, Russian, even some German and Hungarian, he was a very difficult person to catch for the various security services in Europe. He told me the reason he evaded capture for so long is not because of any particular skill he had, but because he was South American and he didn't look like a Middle Eastern terrorist. So he said when he crossed borders, he wasn't given the kind of scrutiny most of his comrades in the Palestinian cause were given. And he said that's part of the reason he was able to survive so long on the run. But eventually he gets thrown out of the PFLP and sort of becomes a hired gun, like a hired assassin, and he's working for both Gaddafi of Libya and Saddam Hussein in Iraq and the Syrian intelligence services. He actually lived in Syria for quite some time in the 80s, and then in the early 90s he moved to Jordan. He eventually ends up in Sudan in 1994, and you probably know who was living in Khartoum back in 1994. Actually, just on the other side of the airport there was Osama Bin Laden. So that is where Carlos was finally located by our own CIA, found him there, and they notified the FBI, and we checked our files, and we had no active arrest warrants for Carlos then because he hadn't, in all his terrorist attacks, he hadn't killed any Americans. So we passed, the CIA provided that information to the French, and the French did what Carlos would consider an illegal rendition and got him out of Sudan and brought him to Paris to face trial. And so he's been in a French prison since 1994. Unusual for France, he's just recently got his third life sentence. And so he probably won't be getting out of prison at all. But that's some background on Carlos the Jackal. And so for me to prepare for this interview, because there was no more case agent, so to speak, in bureau language, I was more of what I would consider to be a lead agent. I had this lead to see what Carlos knew about this murder of this Israeli diplomat, and that's what I wanted to get to the bottom of. And so I had to study Carlos as much as I could and learn as much as I could about the original case, even though there was very little physical evidence from that crime scene to go on. I did end up reading a book that Carlos published from jail in 2003, and that book he called Revolutionary Islam. And there he claims that he actually converted to Islam way back in 1970 when he first went to Jordan and started fighting with the PFLP. And he is now here in 2007 trying to align himself more with religious jihadists and specifically with Al-Qaeda and Osama Bin Laden. And he claims to have met Osama Bin Laden in Lebanon in the 70s and claims to have met Ayman al-Zawahiri, the number 2 in Al-Qaeda, in Khartoum in 1994. My interpretation of these claims in this book are, for a long time, for almost 20 years, he was sort of the biggest badass terrorist in the world. and he was eclipsed, as you know, in 2001 by Osama Bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. And so I think his ego had a hard time adjusting to that, and here he was in this book now trying to say, hey, I was with these guys all along. And I didn't really buy it because I believed he was more that secular Che Guevara, Fidel Castro type of revolutionary, not an ideologue in terms of, he was a Marxist, socialist ideologue, but not a jihadist ideologue. But in this book, he tries to claim otherwise, but I didn't quite buy that.
Is the book almost a confession? Does he admit to killing people?
He doesn't really talk about his actions. He did claim, after he was convicted of murdering those two DST agents at that trial in France in 1995, after that conviction, he claims responsibility for more than 100 attacks and for killing more than 1,500 people for the Palestinian cause. But the book, he doesn't really go into that. It's more of his trying to align himself with the jihadist ideology and his critique of the West in this book. And he really considers the West to be, the evil empire of the world, led by the United States. So that's another challenge for me, being a representative of the United States government. Is this guy really going to talk to me? His two greatest enemies of his career was the United States and Israel, and here comes an FBI agent who wants him to cooperate in the investigation of an Israeli war hero. So that was my challenge, to see if I could get him to cooperate. And I knew from his letter he wanted money, but I knew, the FBI was not going to give a convicted terrorist any money, certainly not for his legal defense.
So what did you have to do to secure this interview?
So what I had to do is I drafted the MLAT request, the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty request, because, as you know, we have no jurisdiction in France, so I couldn't just walk into a French prison and interview him. So I had to officially submit a request through the Department of Justice to the French authorities to request this interview. And normally it would be done by French authorities, and then they would give us a report. We would submit a list of questions, and they would do it and get back to us. But in the request, I had done so much research now, I wanted to be there. Actually, I wanted to conduct the interview. So I put that in the request that the FBI be allowed to be present during this interview. So what happens is it then goes from the DOJ to the French Ministry of Justice, and the French Ministry of Justice then assigns it to an officer to go conduct the interview. So of all the officers in France, all the thousands of either police judiciaire or gendarmerie or the DGSI, which is the modern version of the DST, of all the officers that could get assigned to, it gets assigned to a commissar in the Brigade Criminelle that I happen to know from my liaison work in France. Her name was Adeline, and I told her that, not only did I want to be there, but I wanted to conduct the interview. And at first, she was like, oh, no, this is France, we got to do it by the rules, and blah, blah, blah. She said, but you can be there. I said, okay, good. So she actually delegated the interview to her captain, a guy named Arnaud, and comes the day of the interview, and we're driving to the prison, and he leans over to me and says, oh, by the way, you can do the interview. Because it was obvious, he didn't know anything about the murder of Joseph Alone or too much about Carlos's background, so I think he made the right decision and decided to let me do it. So that's kind of the setup of heading to the prison. And he said, by the way, he had spoken to the warden to get permission for us to come to the prison and conduct the interview, and the warden pretty much said, by the way, I'm not really in charge here. It's really Carlos who's in charge of the prison.
The warden said that?
The warden said that to Arnaud, the captain who was assigned responsibility for this interview. So I was like, interesting. I don't know how much time you've spent in prisons, even in America, but there is that phenomena where the warden's not really always the guy in charge. I mean, there are inmates, and in America we have the gang phenomena where certain gangs actually run certain prisons, and the warden actually has limited influence. Same with organized crime figures, and that's the way Carlos kind of carries himself. He's kind of like a if you didn't know his terrorism background, you would think he might be a mafia boss, because that's kind of the way he holds himself. But anyway, that's kind of a long-winded background to where I had to come up with an interview strategy. He had never been interviewed by the FBI before or anyone from the U.S., and so I had to motivate him to cooperate, in this investigation regarding an Israeli war hero. In his letter, I said it was Black September. Back in the 70s, the FBI, our analytical corps, we did have subject matter experts on Black September. But in 2014, when I was getting ready to do this interview, there were no Black September subject matter experts. So I had to educate myself because I wanted to know as much as I could about Black September, to be able to call out Carlos if he was trying to, give me some incorrect information. I wanted to know that. So I studied Black September. There's actually a book that was written about the Joseph Alone case by a guy named Fred Burton called Chasing Shadows. And I read that book as part of my preparation. Obviously, I read Carlos's book. But the real question is, how do you motivate someone to cooperate in an interview like that? And as you know, as an FBI agent, the most important thing in any interview is building rapport. And how do you get someone to relax and open up and talk to you?
I'm glad you mentioned that, because a lot of TV and movies and books have an FBI agent interrogating a terrorist, and they're shouting and screaming and threatening.
Yeah.
And you're talking about building a rapport. So
yeah, because, Carlos is in a French prison. He's under no obligation to even talk to me or cooperate with me. So, that whole bad cop, tough guy approach in real life, in my experience, just doesn't work. And, I've gotten many confessions during my FBI career. And even though this wasn't going to be an interrogation, because I didn't consider Carlos to be, the person who committed this crime, he's more of a witness. So to me, it was an interview. But I still had to develop that rapport, still had to get him on my side to cooperate and tell me what he knew about Black September's involvement in this assassination. So that, to me, it comes, number one, treating that person with respect. I mean, even if you have to fake it or make it up, if you don't respect the guy because he's a terrorist, you have to at least appear to be that way. And you cannot appear judgmental in any way. Like if I had an attitude of sort of looking down on him, that would just destroy rapport and doesn't work. And you're right, you see that a lot in Hollywood, and that's just not the way it's done in real life, and that's not an effective way to get someone to talk to you. It's different when you have some kind of leverage you can use against a criminal, but this was not that case. So I had to figure out a way, and come up with a plan how I was going to do that. So I also I found two French cops who had actually interviewed Carlos before, getting ready for some of the trials in France, and I talked to them about him to learn more about his personality and his attitude, and they told me he could be very moody and aggressive sometimes and quiet, and sometimes he could be very chatty, but they all said he had a pretty big ego, which I already knew from having read his book. My strategy, my plan was to have a definite response prepared if he asked for money, which I knew he would, and to sort of establish rapport by asking his opinion on, the raging civil war in Syria, because I knew he would have an opinion about that. And the way I wanted to motivate him to try to talk to me was through what I would call indirect, disingenuous flattery, aimed to assuage his ego. And what do I mean by that, indirect, disingenuous flattery? Well, I took a copy of his book, and I put all these tabs on it as if I had studied it, in detail, and I actually had, but these tabs were all fake. I just put them randomly throughout the book, and I brought it with me, but I didn't, leave it, on the top of my little stack of papers in my briefcase, but I kept it, sort of there so he would notice it and see that I had studied him, and I'd hoped to trigger sort of a psychological response, which we call the reciprocity rule. Like if he knew I invested this time and sort of studied him, then maybe he kind of owes me something in return for that. So that was kind of one thing I did. And then the plan B was to appeal to his desire to honor the memory of his Arab comrades, which he mentions in his letter. And plan C, if none of that worked, I was going to try to appeal to his humanity on behalf of the victims' daughters, because that's what was motivating me because I knew Colonel Alone's daughters were still alive in Israel, and they wanted to know desperately what happened to their father. And that's what kept me going. And I knew Carlos himself had a daughter that he cared about, and that was, my last part of my plan was to try to go with that. So that was my plan, and to treat him with respect and almost deference, and because I knew from his book he considered himself to be almost like a world statesman, like a Nelson Mandela, and that's kind of the way he saw himself, someone struggling against a great injustice in the world. So that's the plan. So when I get to the prison, Captain Arnaud tells me I can do it. We get in there, and it's not a very imposing-looking prison in the distant suburbs of Paris. And we get in there, and he's sitting alone in this room, no handcuffs, no orange jumpsuit. It's not like a American Supermax prison. It looks very casual, and he's wearing very nice clothes. And so the French cops, introduce themselves, and I do it, the FBI way, which is I shake his hand and I show him our credentials. And on our credentials, it has, a photo ID and some small print in there. And so he is just, I could see he was not expecting the FBI, which is how I planned it. And
so you did not clear anything with him ahead of time?
No, he just knew the French police wanted to talk to him. That's all he knew. So when he saw me and saw FBI, his mouth just opened. He was a little shocked, and he did something no one's ever done in my 21 years of doing this job, which he read out loud all the small print on my credentials. And when he got to the end, it says, by order of the Attorney General of the United States, he read that out loud and then stuck his finger in my face and said, "What kind of BS is that?" And I responded by saying, that's FBI BS. And when I said that, he kind of half smiled, and then he sat down and relaxed. And I knew just with that little, I felt like he was challenging me there. And right out of the gate, we had this almost instant rapport. And because he smiled, and we sat down. And so instead of going into, his opinions about Syria, I got right down to business and decided to use, that opening. And I showed him the letter that he wrote to his wife that mentions Adam Goldman's article and Operation Alone, as he called it. And I said, "Did you write this letter?" And he said, "Yeah." And so that was me sort of norming him, as we say in the business, seeing his normal response to a question, So this would give me a better idea to catch any indicators of deception later on in the interview if he was lying to me, by seeing how he responds to sort of a test question, because I knew already the answer. I knew he had written it, so he said yes. And when he got to the part of the letter where he wanted all this money from Adam Goldman, he asked me for $1 million. So obviously the FBI was not going to give him $1 million. I said, "No, that's not going to happen." And he looked me in the eye and said, "Who do you represent?" And I said, "Well, I represent the FBI, and in this case, the Montgomery County Police Department, and I'm trying to get to the bottom, for the sake of Joseph Alone's daughters, what happened here?" And he looked at me, and shook his head, and then I slowly started asking him some questions about Black September and their structure and their organization. And Carlos is now 64 years old at this point, but he had an amazing memory for detail, for events, locations, places, people's names. And he's actually written his whole biography that he doesn't want published till after he dies. But So he had great recollection, except for he wasn't very good with last names. So as we're talking about Black September and going through his story, he said, yeah, and then I was with Abu Ali, and I said, do you mean Abu Ali Iyad? He's like, yes, that's the guy. And we keep talking, and he mentions another gentleman's name a few minutes later, and again, can't remember the last name. He's like, and then I was with Ali Hassan, I can't remember. I said, do you mean Ali Hassan Salama? He's like, yes, that's the guy. And he turns to the French cops and says, this FBI agent is serious. I'm going to help him. And
wow.
He gets up, he orders the guards to open various gates and doors, and he leaves the room. And the guards jump as soon as he asks them to do something. They do everything he says. He goes away, comes back like 10 minutes later. He went back to his cell, and he brings me documents and photographs that have to do with Black September and himself and gives them to me. And he brings cigars because he had been getting regular visits from the ambassador to France from Venezuela. And he gives me and my FBI coworker there, Pierre, who I brought in case he wanted to speak in French, but luckily he preferred English. So he gives me a nice Cuban cigar, and he gives the French cops the cheap Dominican cigars. And we start smoking cigars and talking about the case for the next 5 hours. That was the first interview. And he was a fascinating guy because he kind of wanted to impress me at the same time as the feeling I got. And he told me about some of his exploits, and he told me he killed 83 people with his own hands.
Do you believe that?
I do, based on he said he was responsible for over 1,500 deaths, which might be an exaggeration, but if you look at all the total of attacks he was involved in, either directly or indirectly, I would say that's roughly accurate. He would go off on these incredible tangents that didn't always have to do with Joseph alone, but I didn't want to interrupt him because I wanted to keep that rapport and respect going. And
so you're taking notes this whole time. This is not being recorded.
Yeah, I'm taking notes. It's a regular standard interview. I'm asking the questions and taking notes. And after 5 hours, the French cops, hey, we got to go. And I've barely gotten through 1/4 of my questions. So we've got to come back. And we end up coming back 3 times and roughly 5 hours each time as he slowly tells me the whole story of what he knows about the murder of Joseph Alone in Maryland in 1973. And he was a fascinating guy to spend that much time with because he was, a fascinating guy to talk to and to interview. And he was not your normal standard person you talk to because of, how he carried himself, how he thought of himself, how he was able to order the French prison guards around. The French police, they were taking notes as well on a laptop computer, and they do their interview reports slightly different than we do. They actually type them up at the scene and have the witness sign the statement. So as they were finishing up their report, Carlos and I are out in the hallway of this prison just walking around in this courtyard, and suddenly a woman starts coming down the hallway towards us, and he tells me, hey, this is the prison English teacher. I've been trying to, and he told me what he wanted to do with her in crude terms. And he said, I've been trying to do that for a long time now, but she won't have anything to do with me. So he waves her over and goes, hey, look, the FBI's here to talk to me. So I realized that he's trying to impress her so he could sleep with her through me. And I'm like, this is awkward. And she doesn't give him the time of day and just walks off. And she's not impressed that he's, the FBI's there to talk to him. She couldn't care less. He walks off. And literally not 5 minutes later, the same thing happened again. Another woman happens to be walking down the hallway, and this is the prison psychologist. And he tells me the same thing, that he's been trying to sleep with her for a long time. And he calls her over and does the same thing. Hey, look, the FBI is here to talk to me. And she couldn't care less either. She doesn't give him the time of day. And he's like, yeah, she won't see me because I've been medically declared sane. It was kind of comedic, but I felt like I was in an awkward, wingman position there, and so I had to go along with it and to keep the rapport going. I'm like, French girls, better luck next time. and we had a good laugh, But that's kind of the way the FBI does it to get people to cooperate and talk to us. You sort of become their buddy. It may not be all real, but you try to be yourself as much as you can.
Well, let me ask you this question, because, you're talking about indirect, disingenuous flattery.
Yeah.
But did you like him? It sounds like he's a kind of a charming guy.
I found him to be charming, actually, for a terrorist. And he kind of reminded me, I know there's this TV commercial about the world's most interesting man for a beer commercial, and he reminds me of that guy. Like, he is the most interesting man. And the stories he told were really unbelievable, and he was quite the name dropper. So he'd be talking about, Urian drop-off and Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi and Bashar al-Assad, King Fahd of Saudi Arabia, all these people that he knew personally, and it was fascinating. And I saw the way he interacted with folks there, and I think the warden was right. He really did kind of run that prison a little bit, because one day, the last interview was an extremely hot day. I was asking him some questions that really made him go back to access his memory of, 40 years earlier, and he was concentrating, and I could see he was getting really upset. I didn't know what was upsetting him, but there was, we were sitting pretty close to the inner courtyard where the exercise yard was for the other prisoners, and there was, some normal noise coming from there, but it must have really been bothering him. So he just jumps up at one point, yells to the guards. They open all the doors for him. He goes out into the prison yard, and I can hear him scream in French, "Shut the F up, we're working in here." And complete silence in the prison yard after he says that. And so he really was like the boss. They absolutely, listened to him and did what he said. Another time, I'd asked him about his first wife, who I think is the real love of his life. Her name is Magdalena Kopp. She was actually a German terrorist with the German revolutionary cells. And I would always ask about her and his daughter when I visited him. And the last time I saw him, he said that she had passed away 2 weeks earlier. And so I was, offering up my condolences. And, the French cops had no idea what I was talking about and who Magdalena was. But the point is, it pays to do your homework, because we had this real connection. We related to each other as human beings. And that's the way I think you get people to cooperate. And he did. He fully cooperated. Now, the thing is, I don't know if the information he gave me will actually solve the case. That's the disappointing part of it. But I think there is still a small chance that after all these years, this case could be resolved based on what he told me. And here's what he told me in a nutshell. It took him 15 hours to say this, but in a nutshell, he told me he knew the head of Fatah, the Palestinian PLO representative in Paris, was a guy named Mahmoud Saleh, who ran a bookstore in Paris back in the 70s. And that was sort of the unofficial PLO headquarters at the time. And he knew another Black September operative called Kamal Kirbek, who was a Syrian guy. So he was friends with both these folks. And he happened to be with Kamal Kirbek in the summer of 73 when the news reached them about the murder of Israeli Colonel Joseph Alon in Maryland. And he said among all the Palestinian groups, everyone wanted to know who did this. Was it one of us? What happened? Because normally he said they would have known ahead of time and it would have been common knowledge and whoever did it would have been praised, but no one seemed to know who killed Colonel Alon. So he was with this Black September operative who he did this OPEC oil operation I told you with, in coordination with. And he's with him, and Kamal Kirbek tells Carlos, "I can't believe those guys did it." And Carlos is like, "What? What do you mean? What happened?" And so Kamal Kirbek tells Carlos this story that he was with this Palestinian bookstore owner, Mahmoud Saleh, one day. And Mahmoud Saleh said, "Hey, I got these 3 Americans. They're Vietnam vets who have become disillusioned with the Vietnam War and with America, and they want to do something for the Palestinian cause." So this Palestinian bookstore owner, the PLO rep in Paris, arranges for this Black September operative to meet with these three former American soldiers. And back in those days, in the late 60s, early 70s, Paris was kind of a hotbed of anti-Vietnam War sentiment or anti-American involvement in Vietnam sentiment. So it kind of makes sense that Americans with those feelings could be there. And there were plenty of deserters from American bases in Germany who ended up in France to avoid being captured for going AWOL. So anyway, the story that Kamal Kirbek told Carlos is that Kamal had to sit down on the left bank of Paris at a cafe with these three Americans, and they told this Black September operative that they wanted to do something for the Palestinian cause. And according to Carlos, Kamal Kirbek didn't take them very seriously and said, okay, if you really want to do something for the Palestinian cause, go back to America and you can murder the new military attaché for Israel, this Israeli fighter pilot war hero named Joseph Alon. And that's it. They end the meeting. And then a couple of years later, when they get the news, Kamal Kirbek is with Carlos and says, I can't believe they did it. After all this time, that they actually did it. He was like in shock. And so that's kind of the story that Carlos conveyed to me. That it was.
And were you able to identify these three Americans?
No, but we're still working on that. So I transferred, I took everything I found out, transferred it back to FBI Baltimore to the Rockville RA, which covers Chevy Chase, Maryland, where this happened, and had the case reopened. And one thing the FBI did really well after reading all 7,000 pages of that old case file is the only thing we really had to go on was the murder weapon. There were no shell casings because it was a revolver, but we did recover several of the bullets and were able to identify the type of weapon used. It was either an Arminius .38 revolver or a Titan Tiger .38 revolver. And so the FBI figured out that there were about 74,000 of these weapons sold in the last few years prior to the murder in 73, east of the Mississippi in the United States. So they tried to track all 74,000 of those weapons. So the FBI meticulously went through that. It reminds me a little bit of the way the FBI meticulously went through so many records to find James O. Ray for the assassination of Martin Luther King. But they did an incredible job researching the sale of all these weapons, but they were looking mostly for Arab Americans or Arab-sounding terrorists. They weren't looking for American military personnel who may have bought these weapons. So that's what I've asked FBI Maryland to look into to see if there's some chance they could actually go talk to, because in that case file there are multiple people mentioned by name, with a military background in that case file. And I asked them to go try that as a way to possibly verify Carlos's story, in addition to other ideas I had about, confirming intelligence about Kamal Kirbek's involvement with Black September, etc. But yeah, so Carlos and I continue to write to each other, and, we kind of maintain this relationship based on the rapport that wasn't completely faked. It was, we are generally interested in each other as human beings, and we've kept up some contact since then. And
so now that you're retired,
yeah,
what would be the purpose of you wanting to maintain this communication with him?
Part of the purpose is if he happened to remember any new key details of that case, I'm sure he would tell me. And the other is just personal interest. I was an English major in college, so I'm quite a bit of a books nerd, and I read a lot. And obviously he's sitting in prison all day, and he reads a lot. And we actually share book recommendations and talk about, we have similar interest in books on world events and terrorism and things like that. And his opinion is usually pretty fascinating. Obviously I don't always agree with his stances, but he's a very smart guy, speaks multiple languages. He's kind of like an evil genius. And we just, happen to hit it off. And I respect the fact that he cooperated, because he didn't have to cooperate with me on this case. He was under no obligation. And I think I got to him based on, my strategy. He did notice the book. I asked him to sign a copy of his book to me that first day. He was very proud to do that. We just kept it going.
So you wrote this very detailed and comprehensive article, Smoking with the Jackal, and, I'll link to that in the episode show notes. But you really have a book here. And, I'm always telling people, you got to write a book. Is that something that you would think about doing, whether you write a true crime book, a nonfiction, or whether you take the story and adapt it to a fictionalized version, a thriller?
I think there could be a book there if it ends up solving the case. But as it stands now, I'm not sure it's worthy of a complete book. Maybe a chapter in a book of all my FBI stories, and I actually do plan on writing a book like that. So this could be a chapter in it, but I don't think it's worthy of an entire book, unless it happens to lead towards the solving of the case. And
well, I hope it does.
Yeah, I do too.
Yeah. So this has been fascinating, absolutely fascinating. I'd like to talk a little bit about the interviewing strategies that you taught. I don't want to give away any FBI secrets, but are there things that in talking to law enforcement officers or people who are just writing books and want to get it right, are there things that you would be able to share with us?
Yeah, that's why I wrote that article, is because, when American law enforcement has a chance to talk to a terrorist, whether it's a domestic terrorist or an international terrorist, you usually get one shot to get it right, to establish that rapport, and I think that's so important. And, as I was an instructor at the academy for exactly this topic, I started to give real-life examples, including this example of an interview I had with Carlos the Jackal, and my students were so fascinated by it and taken by it that's the reason I developed it into an article, to emphasize how important preparation is, how important it was for me to do my homework, for me to know that he had a wife and a daughter, and to know the details ahead of time so he couldn't sort of fake me out with a fake story, or to be able to call BS or not. And to think of a strategy, have a plan going in. If I couldn't motivate him by, trying to assuage his ego and having him notice indirectly I did all this research on him, then I had a plan B, which is having to talk about maybe I can get his empathy by talking about his daughters, or a plan C where I could get him to try to get credit for this assassination to Black September that hadn't been publicly acknowledged before. And just having a plan and emphasis on planning and rapport building, so important to any interview or interrogation. And I've gotten so many signed confessions by using this, I guess you'd call it the nice guy approach, the friendly. I like to sort of model it off of Columbo, the TV detective Columbo, he appeared to be a bumbling guy, but it was really not. He was really always had a plan and was smart and tried to put people at ease so they'd talk to him. And that's the key to success, I think, of any interview or interrogation.
One of the things that you mentioned in this article is in building a rapport that you have to sometimes share about your life too. You actually say you got to give to get. So what did you share with him?
Well, we were both, it was a stretch, but we were both of the Americas, so we were both sort of two Americans in Europe who had lived and worked in Europe and the Middle East, because I had spent time in Saudi Arabia, and that was helpful in establishing rapport and connection with him. So my stories about my time in the Middle East and Saudi Arabia and Jordan, and his stories about Jordan and dealing with the French and the French system and French justice, which I was very knowledgeable about at the time as well, really helped us, having those similarities. We're both like two expats in France, and that really helped.
All right, so I'd like to learn a little bit about you, if we have a little bit of time. When did you join the FBI, and why did you join the FBI?
I joined the FBI, actually applied in 1992, but I didn't get in until 1996. So that was a long 4-year wait for me. There was a hiring freeze and et cetera, and my background check took forever because I had traveled to so many foreign countries. But I grew up in New York City. My dad was an NYPD cop, and his only career advice to me was don't ever be a cop. So I actually ended up on Wall Street as a compliance officer, so I was sort of like a company cop investigating people in my investment bank back in the days of Boesky and Milken about insider trading. So I was sort of a company cop, and I really liked investigating. But after I caught the people in my firm, my job is to quietly catch them before the FBI or Giuliani would catch them and quietly fire them to keep our name out of the Wall Street Journal and scandal. But after I caught them, I was bored, and I thought, well, I really like this investigating, but where can I do it where I wouldn't just get bored looking after one thing, like insider trading? And the only thing I could think of was the FBI. So I applied after getting my MBA, and I actually enjoyed every day of those 21 years. No 2 days were alike. And I got to decide, what to do on which one of my cases each day. And, it's not like the movies. We didn't have a partner. You're your own case agent. You decide on your cases what you're going to do each day. And that was tremendous freedom, and I really enjoyed the job and the work. It can be over-consuming sometimes, and I certainly worked more than my share of nights and weekends, but very satisfying work, and very happy I chose that as my career.
So, Eugene, what are you doing now?
Well, I just retired, and I moved from Virginia back up into Connecticut, where I haven't lived since the early 80s, to be closer to my parents who are getting old. And so I'm participating in some of the elder care responsibilities. And I also do plan to write a couple of books, as we discussed earlier. I do want to write sort of one nonfiction book that is sort of my stories of the FBI, which would probably include a chapter on Carlos. And then I want to write a fictionalized book of an investigation. And I haven't quite decided, but probably be a Colombian money laundering type case, which was some of my favorite cases to work as an agent.
Well, I like to always give my guests the last word. What would you like to say?
I guess I'd like to say if there's anyone out there thinking of a career as a special agent in the FBI, that I know in my business school class, I was the only one to go that route into government, and I know a lot of my colleagues made a lot more money in the private sector with an MBA, but for me, I had such a rewarding career in terms of job satisfaction. I would wake up every day wanting to go to work, wanting to be on that trail of, usually I specialized in financial investigations, and I was, hot on the money trail, whether it was terrorism, finance, or fraud, or bribery, and I really enjoyed that. And I would encourage anyone out there who's got, an interest in becoming a special agent, that the Bureau can use good people, and there are a lot of good people there. And if you're looking for an adventure with no 2 days alike and making a difference in the world, I would say go ahead and apply.
And that's the end of the interview. As always, back at jerrywilliams.com, you'll find a photo of Eugene Casey, newspaper articles about Carlos the Jackal, and an excellent article written by Eugene Casey all about his debriefing of Carlos the Jackal. I hope you enjoyed the interview. I hope you share it with your friends, family, and associates. If you're listening to this on a podcast app, you can share it directly from your device. If you're on my website, jerrywilliams.com, at the bottom of the show notes, you'll find all the social media share buttons. Can I ask you to do just one more thing? Could you please rate and review FBI Retired Case File Review on Apple Podcast or your favorite podcast app? Remember, Reviews help listeners find good podcasts. Don't you want to help me show the world what great work FBI agents do? I have a good crime fiction recommendation for you today. It's probably not crime fiction, but more like psychological suspense. The novel is Truly, Madly Guilty by Liane Moriarty. Now, Liane is the author of Big Little Lies, which was a series on HBO. The plot centers on three couples who attend a barbecue with their children. Something happens at that barbecue, a horrible, terrible incident. What makes this a suspense novel is that you don't find out what that incident is until at least 3/4 into the book, but you are told a little bit about the incident in each chapter. It really makes you want to stick with the story to find out what everyone is talking about. So my recommendation for this week is Truly, Madly Guilty by Liane Moriarty. And while you're at Amazon taking a look at Truly, Madly Guilty, I hope you also check out my FBI crime thriller, Pay to Play, about a female FBI agent investigating corruption in the Philadelphia strip club industry. Pay to Play is available as an ebook, trade paperback, and audiobook. This episode was sponsored by FBIRetired.com, the only online directory made available to the general public featuring retired FBI agents and analysts interested in showcasing their skills to secure business opportunities. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope you come back again for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.